Hi to everyone who's just joining. We're just going to wait one more minute and then we'll be starting the conversation with Julia and Claire. So just waiting for a couple more to come into the Zoom. A bit of housekeeping for those who are already on. There's a chat function. We'd love for you to share any of that. And then we've got the Q&A function. So for anyone who wants to put a question, we are going to be time for Q&A for Julia and Claire at the end of today's session. So if you send questions through to us, and then we'll make sure we can get some of those at the end. Great to see so many of you joining. We'll just give people one more minute and then we'll kick off with some introductions. Okay, welcome everyone. We've got a few more who are still coming onto the Zoom, just trickling in, but we wanted to make sure that we use the most of the time that we've got with Julia and Claire today. So it's really great to have so many people here on what is such an important topic at the moment. I am your host today. My name is Daisy Abbott. I'm Head of Client Solutions here at Unmind. And for those of you who don't know Unmind, we are a proactive wellbeing partner to clients across the world and helping organizations to navigate the tricky waters which can be wellbeing in the workplace. And we cover all range of topics, and it felt very fitting that we covered this topic today. So I'm thrilled to be joined by both Julia and Claire. Before we kick off, I'm going to hand it over to Julia first to introduce herself, and then to Claire, and then we've got some questions for both of them and some time for some Q&A. So Julia, I'm going to hand over to you. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and what you're bringing to today.
Great. Thank you, Daisy, and good morning, everybody. My name's Julia Biles. I'm Group Head of Wellbeing at Saga. And I've been there for 10 months, and prior to that I was Global Head of Wellbeing at Bupa for 8 years as well. So really looking forward to joining the conversation today and bringing my knowledge and experience around workplace health and embedding financial wellbeing campaigns. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. And also joined by Claire Seal today. So Claire, over to you for your intro.
Hello. Claire Seal. I am a financial coach and an author, and I also have quite a big community on Instagram as My Frugal Year. I didn't come into sort of working in this space in a particularly conventional route. It actually started when I was experiencing real financial difficulty of my own, and I used social media as a bit of a kind of outlet and an accountability tool, and just really sort of spontaneously and really organically that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. I started writing about it more and kind of delving into the layers and layers and layers underneath financial difficulty and how it links to well-being. So really delighted to be here and sort of offer like a bit of a personal perspective, but also now in my role as a coach, what the experiences are of some of my clients and some of the insights from that.
Brilliant. Thank you both. We're so pleased that you both could join us and bringing your own perspectives to today's discussion. So before we head into some quizzing from myself to both Julia and Claire, wanted just to frame what you can expect from today. It goes without saying that we know that this is a very pertinent and a very sensitive topic. Us at Unmind, we're very used to dealing with stigmatized topics, as the conversation around mental health has been shrouded in stigma for years. But we recognise and acknowledge that financial health and wellbeing also carries its own stigma and shame. And we are incredibly passionate about opening up that conversation, and really thrilled that we have two experts joining us here today. We know that this is hugely pertinent as the cost of living crisis is ongoing for many of us here, and there's some really key stats that just bring that to life. So we know that 1 in 3 employees are feeling financial anxiety is going to be affecting their performance at work, and almost half of adults are heading into debt. So we couldn't not touch on this subject, and we're so pleased that we have the opportunity to do that today. We have a bumper-packed agenda of questions, but they're going to be framed around these 3 elements here. So firstly, when we think about mental health and well-being at Unmind, we frame them with these 3 areas. So with relation to financial health, we're going to be asking Claire and Julia to comment on how can we support ourselves during this time of difficulty. Then thinking about how can we use those skills to support others around us, and asking questions around if we are a manager or a leader or a peer in the workplace, what can we be doing to support others around them? And then how can we, in our organizations that we work with and as employers, be supporting those employees who sit within those companies? So this framework is going to guide the questions that we planned for Julia and Claire, but of course, really keen to incorporate your questions as well. So please do put those through in the Q&A. So I will stop sharing my screen. So firstly, thinking about that individual financial health and well-being, there's a question I wanted to put to you both, and perhaps I'll come to you first, Claire. How do you think financial and mental well-being interlink?
I mean, I think there are so many touch points between the two that they're almost kind of sandwiched together. And it was one of the things that I kind of started to unravel when I started to think about why things were going so wrong for me in terms of my relationship with money and how that was filtering into everything else. But I think, money has its tendrils into almost every area of our lives. It affects the decisions that we make. It can cause tensions in our relationships, whether that's with family members, friends, sometimes partners, children. And it also affects, the way that we interact in the workplace, because there is that kind of really difficult sort of structure to get your head around, of that we're all going to work to be paid, but lots of people still feel real awkwardness discussing their salary, and particularly if they're looking for kind of a salary review or any extra support from the workplace. So it really gets into every area of your life, and that's when it can start affecting things like your sleep, like your behaviors. Lots of people, when they're experiencing financial anxiety, find it very difficult to concentrate on anything else, because quite often if your brain's trying to find a way to link things back to money, it's quite easy for it to do that. So every single decision that you're making throughout the day, from whether to pack a lunch for yourself, to whether to pick up a coffee, to whether you can afford to take a taxi to avoid getting completely soaked, those all become massive decisions. So, and then on the flip side, I think quite often, especially because we're maybe feeling really overwhelmed by the news cycle around the cost of living crisis, it can sometimes cause people to really switch off and become quite despondent and bury their head in the sand, and that can lead to kind of low mood or feeling powerless or depressed. So there's a really strong bond between the two, and I think quite often people aren't able necessarily to change their actual financial behavior till they start to unpick the links between the two.
Mm-hmm. So hugely interlinked, and perhaps unable to separate both mental and financial well-being. Julia, I'd love your view on how you see them interlink, and also kind of building on that, given that they are so close together, why do you think this has become an issue that workplaces are now focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. Building on what Claire said, I mean, financial well-being and mental well-being are, as you say, like sandwiched together, and I sort of see it as a bit of a vicious cycle in a way, that they feed into each other. So It's, you know, if you've got financial worries, that's likely to increase your stress and anxiety. And we know that when you have stress and anxiety, it's harder to concentrate. It might be harder to perform at work, and it might be harder to manage your spending and make those decisions, and, you know, spend time being able to find discounts and things like that. And you might make rash decisions and things like that. So stress and anxiety has an impact on our behavior, and because of our financial well-being, you know, extending into every area of our life, that then impacts on that as well. And so it drives up anxiety again. So it can be a very hard cycle to break. And I think, to your point, Daisy, about why this is a workplace issue, well, it's a daily concern. So, you know, right from, well, am I going to commute to work today? You know, can I afford the petrol or the bus fare or the train fare? Or am I going to stay at home and pay for the energy bill that I've got to pay for at home? So I think, you know, am I going to buy lunch out or a coffee out, or am I going to pack my leftovers? You know, like you said, Claire, it really does impact everything. I think specifically at work, we know that when stress and anxiety are in place, we have higher absence rates. So obviously that impacts on the organisational performance, and the ripple effect on the team as well, if one person is absent and then the rest of the team having to pick up the load as well. So I think that the impact is huge. We know, I was just doing a bit of research before this webinar, that I think really sadly over 100,000 people a year in England attempt to take their own life due to financial worries, and, you know, that does start to ripple through into the workplace. We're not immune to that. So I think that you know, there are lots and lots of concerns that are coming to the fore in the workplace, and I'm sure we're going to get into a few more of those later on, but absolutely linked.
Thanks, Julia. So I think from an individual perspective, there's definitely lots on people's plates right now. And as you said, we'll be touching on kind of how the workplace also has a duty of care and responsibility to help with that. I'd love to ask a question to you now, Claire, around how an individual might gain some confidence and clarity over their personal finances. I think we could probably spend the whole webinar talking about this, but given your background, I'd love for you to share some practical tips with those on the call around really increasing that confidence and understanding of where they stand from their own perspective.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to do really is to focus on like your actual sphere of influence and control. So it's really difficult, especially when the news cycle is so noisy, with all of this information, most of which is quite negative, to focus on the things that are within your control. But it's really important to do that, because otherwise you can feel quite powerless. And there are lots of things that you can do. So we're not particularly well educated financially, you know, at the points where it would really help, so throughout school and university. But one thing that you can do to feel really empowered and improve that confidence is to look at, you know, make a list of some areas where you don't really understand your personal finances, and then seek out some information and some education on that. And there are loads of really great free resources. So Martin Lewis and moneysavingexpert.com actually have a course on the Open University that's completely free to do, but it's a complete sort of 360 personal finance course, and that can give you a really good grounding in the basics. Things like trying to do incremental habit change. So once you've identified those gaps, once you've thought about where you'd like to be financially and any goals that you might have, you can start implementing those. So I'm sure most people will have heard of Atomic Habits by James Clear, but lots of the methods there can be really beautifully applied to personal finance. So making really small changes in your habits, you know, whether that's, saving a small amount that you can afford at the beginning of every month, not kind of aiming for the stars to the point where you're then having to withdraw back out of your savings, but maybe just saving £5 a month, £10 a month, because then you're putting the habit in place. And then when your affordability is better, you're already a saver. So it's really about having a little bit of time, identifying the gaps in your knowledge, thinking about what you want from your money, and then putting sort of small habits and small behavioural changes into place in order to get there. I mean, I'll leave it there, but like you said, I'll probably talk for sort of an hour or so just on that.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Claire. And I think it just highlights that there is so much opportunity for learning in this space, because it's just not something that we learn about in school. It's not part of our education so far. So some really useful practical tips there. My next question is for you, Julia, thinking about everybody having individual differences when it comes to how they've been impacted. And given that your role as group head of wellbeing, I'm sure this is pertinent to you, but how would you say someone's income is impacting the types of challenges that they're facing at the moment?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting kind of topic to explore, because I think it's, you know, and in no way am I making any comparison between sort of lower paid workers and higher paid workers, but I do think it impacts everyone on the whole spectrum, but in different ways. So obviously, you know, lower paid workers and are going to be more impacted by the sort of, you know, it might be debt management. It might be kind of, how am I going to make choices about what, you know, am I going to make, people are having to make choices between, am I going to clothe my children or feed them, those sorts of things, you know, in the really kind of like hardship kind of severe end, which is obviously something that we want to talk about, like you said, about financial education, etc., but really supporting them in the way that they need. I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that even higher paid workers are going to be impacted by this as well. They might have less of the budgeting skills, for example, because they just haven't developed them, and they might be have, you know, huge mortgages that they've actually got, you know, have on themselves, that actually are now, we are seeing people having to sell their homes as a result, that they're just not able to meet the demands of interest rates and increased energy costs and things like that. I think, you know, there's a difference between obviously having to like tighten your belt and actually literally having to make choices between food or clothes. But I think the stress and anxiety is relative to kind of where you are on that spectrum. And I think it's important that we all acknowledge that you know, money is something that we all have to manage and get better at managing. And as we go into next year, it's only going to increase in terms of that need to manage it better. So I think it's just important that we don't just assume that it's only affecting a small proportion of the population. I think it's probably going to be affecting everybody, and I think we need to just think of ways that we can design, certainly in the workplace, campaigns and communication and events that you know, that are relevant to the whole spectrum.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Julia. I think that's really helpful to, I guess, encourage us to be thinking of everybody during this time. The next part I wanted to move on to is, now we've had some practical skills thinking about how we as individuals are impacted. I'd love for us to share some thoughts on how we can support each other. And to help us do that, I'm going to share with you a quick video from our head of science here, Dr. Heather Bolton. She's going to give us just 30 seconds on some practical tips, and then we can have time for both your views, Claire and Julie, on how we can support each other.
So what should you do if an employee tells you that they're experiencing financial difficulty? Number one, listen without judgment. It's never easy to hear that someone is upset or in trouble. With an issue like finances, which can feel very practical, it can be tempting to jump straight into problem-solving modes, but sitting with someone's distress can make them feel heard and more understood. Remember, everyone's journey is different, so make sure you defer judgment and use your supportive conversation skills. Number two, help clarify the problem. Invite the person to reflect and to clearly outline what difficulties they're facing in a practical sense. This will help them feel in control of the situation and provide clarity around the issue for you. For instance, someone might feel overwhelmed by their financial situation as a whole and also be facing a specific or more immediate challenge. Number three, share helpful resources. If someone is struggling financially, listening and clarifying the problem can be really helpful, but sometimes people need more. Encourage your employee to tackle financial difficulties proactively. It's not in your remit to offer advice. You're there to support, encourage, and to signpost to helpful resources. These could include professional resources, such as the Money Advice Service, which includes online budgeting tools and financial planning templates. Leveraging your company employee assistance program, that's your EAP. These often include services offering financial advice.
I'm gonna pause Heather there and thank her for her contributions. Maybe we could just get some virtual raised hands. If anyone on this call is a manager or looks after employees, love to get a sense of how many we have here. We're really keen to give you some practical tips and a viewpoint on how we can be supporting those within the workplace. So my first question to you, perhaps, Julia, as a manager and a leader, how would you encourage those in perhaps your organization to be supporting their team members with financial worries?
Yeah, thank you, Daisy. So I think the first thing for managers and leaders is to be able to create a safe space for people to be able to reach out and talk to them. And I think something that we're doing at Saga is we're rolling out a resilience program called Performance Energy, which does exactly that. So it enables people to build trust with their teams and their managers, to help them to talk about things like mental well-being, like financial well-being, in a way that they might not have been able to talk about before, by creating like a common language so that everyone can talk about things in a kind of common way. So there's no judgment, like Heather was saying just then. So I think that's the first thing, is you've got to create trust, you've got to build trust, and that comes often from vulnerability from leaders in the first place. So leaders and managers talking about their own challenges that they might have had is a really, really strong and easy way to create that trust to start with. I think the next thing is to, absolutely not try and fix the problem. So we are not, managers and leaders are not expected to be financial experts, just like we're not expected to be psychologists or counsellors. So it's really about really knowing what support your organisation has available. So getting really clear on the resources and actually having to go and do that research yourself, because often the resources will be there on your local intranet or something like that, but you might need to just go and find them out and, almost just have like a post-it note, by your desk where you've got the EAP number. We also have a life management service via our EAP, which offers financial and debt management advice. So really knowing that and doing the signposting really well is really helpful. But before even the signposting, it is that listening piece. So just being to like actively listen, no judgment, safe space, and just giving them the time, I think, is really important in this day and age. Everything's so rushed. If you can meet face to face, that can often be much more helpful. But if you can't, then if someone just wants to speak on the phone, they don't want to have their video on, they might want to take a walk. Just being really empathetic. One of our core values at Saga is empathy, and I think it's just having that in the forefront of your mind, just thinking how someone's going to be feeling. If they're actually brave enough to come and talk to you, then really thanking them for that openness, and asking them, what help they think they need, and then following up as well is really important. So don't just leave it hanging. Once you've kind of given them the signposting, checking in regularly with them, I think it's really important. And I, again, could go on for a long time about this. So I think, that vulnerability, that knowing where to signpost, and that active listening is really important.
Thanks, Julia. That's some really helpful practical tips. Claire, I'm sure you've advised lots of your clients over the last few years who are struggling themselves, but also surrounded by people who might be struggling with this topic as well. Have you been giving advice to them on how they can support people around them?
Yeah, so I mean, lots and lots of my clients are in management positions themselves at work, and are sort of, I think it can feel it can feel a bit odd for people if they feel like they're in a kind of position of authority. And quite a lot of the time, I mean, it's been referenced throughout the webinar so far, of often, is people in management or whom are maybe on like a higher income really trap themselves in a situation whereby a slight increase in the cost of living is enough to break their budget and make things really, really tight and really stressful. And I think really what Julia's just said and what Heather said in the video about kind of trying to sit outside of judgment and have safe spaces to discuss this stuff is just completely paramount. So making sure that the culture is set up so that things like this can be discussed. I think it's so easy to absorb just from sort of the general discourse and society, the stigma around money and the judgment around sort of not being able to manage money or struggling with money, because we see it even in fiction, you know, debt or financial difficulty are used to really sort of like denigrate someone's character. Even things like Line of Duty, we were led to believe that maybe Ted Hastings might be corrupt because he had financial difficulty. So we're absorbing that from all of these different places. And so, you know, it can be really, really hard not to sit in judgment when someone comes with their financial problems, because quite often we're using like our own map of the world and what we know about money, and kind of judging people maybe based on our own experiences and what we would do in that situation. But I think, yeah, having an idea of how brave you have to be. I was never brave enough. When I was really struggling, I had like 27 grand worth of debt and I was being paid 27 and a half a year. I would never have been brave enough to go to someone at work and ask for help. You know, it took my Instagram account where I talked about this stuff, it took me a year not to be anonymous. So I think if someone's brave enough to come to you with this stuff, you know, whether you know and understand what they're going through or not, it's just really, really important to acknowledge that and to try and put that judgment to one side.
Thanks, Claire. That's really helpful. Julia, did you want to comment on that?
Just building on that, I think there's a couple of bits in the chat as well. I think the confidentiality side of things is really important. So there will be people who will not be brave enough, and there'll be people that you just would never do that. And we do, obviously, we're lucky at Saga that we have a confidential EAP where people can access that and self-serve. But there will be organisations that don't have EAPs, smaller organisations and things like that. But there is a wealth of knowledge on the internet. I'm sure we'll be sharing some links later. But even just going onto the Bank Workers Charity, going onto your own bank itself, like websites, Salary Finance and things like that, have just so much advice. I think my kind of take on that, though, if you're not brave enough to go to your employer, are you brave enough to talk to a friend? Are you brave enough to talk to your partner? Are you brave enough just to broach it with anyone? Like the same with mental illness, it's very similar. Like, who do you feel confident enough to trust that you can actually start to break it down and start to talk about it? The more that you don't talk about it, the bigger it becomes inside. So I think recognizing that a very large number of people just wouldn't feel comfortable is really important, but continuing to create that space and normalize financial well-being and kind of trying to destigmatize it, just like we had to do with mental well-being 10 years ago, is the journey that I think workplaces can really play a part in. So
yeah, thanks, Julia. And I think in the chat, I noticed Lynn mentioned that inspiring that culture of trust is so important. It's something we're very, very familiar with talking about here at Unmind, as we want to encourage the organisations we work with to speak openly about mental health, but we know that financial health and financial well-being has its own stigma. So that culture of trust and openness is definitely a practical tip for managers. Last question I'd love to ask is thinking about employers. We've got lots of managers on this call. Thank you for all those who raised their hand. Julia, you will have seen how employers around you and also Saga itself are navigating this for employees. Over and above the financial initiatives that we've seen, such as salary raises or salary advance platforms, what have you seen is really great ideas or best practice that companies are doing to support employee well-being during this time?
So I think, again, I could talk for a long time on this. So I think the first thing, best practice is that your employee wellbeing strategy is 100% aligned to your business strategy, and that you have got leadership buy-in. If you haven't got that, then you're going to struggle. So I think that's absolutely vital. So and then I think the second thing that's really important and really helpful, especially for larger organisations, is branding and communications. So really making it easily accessible and very clear to your colleagues and employees, what do you stand for in terms of wellbeing in your organization? And at Saga, we have we've just recently launched our Be Well strategy. So people know that, Be Well is the name of our employee wellbeing kind of proposition. And we have 3 very clear pillars, which is work well, live well, and think well. And under live well sits our financial wellbeing alongside physical wellbeing as well. So kind of that helps you to really start to brand and communicate in a really clear way, and through your different channels of your local intranet or whatever it might be. It sounds simple, but it can be quite effective, because again, it gives that common language and a shortcut, if you like, into difficult topics. So that's probably 2 things. So aligning it to your business strategy, getting really good branding and communications. I think having a really clear communication plan is also really helpful. So for example, we've dedicated the whole of Q4 actually to financial wellbeing. And so every week we have a Be Well newsletter that focuses on financial wellbeing. We have videos from our senior leaders talking about their own kind of, wellbeing in general, but also just how they manage their health and mental wellbeing as well. We gave loads of tips and tricks, if you like, so links to budget calculators, savings tips, we have discounts, how do you cook on a budget, all of those sorts of things. So trying to meet the need of the range of colleagues and job roles that we have at Saga. That can be a challenge, and we definitely haven't got it right all the time so far. So I think working towards those things. And I think having total reward statements is actually a really helpful thing for people. Again, we're working towards that at Saga, because I just think it gives a complete overview, very holistic view of everything that is available to you, because often people just won't make use of some of the benefits that are there, because either they just don't know about them, or they don't know how to access them, or there might be some stigma around it. So again, kind of could go on and on. I think probably circling back to the trust piece, like building that psychological safety in your organization is probably the absolutely foundational to having good workplace health. Without that trust, it's just not going to stick. So
great, thank you for that, Julia. Claire, I'd love to get your thoughts on, perhaps you've seen organizations around you doing some great things. I'm sure we've all seen not so great things, but let's share some tips on what we know is working. Are there kind of practical, budget-friendly things that you've seen companies do, or you would advise companies to think about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things is encouraging open conversations like this. So I do quite a lot of corporate wellbeing, whether it's workshops or speaking, but the thing that I do immediately in all of them is just talk about the many ways in which I messed up with money, and how things can turn around and have turned around. And honestly, you can almost hear the sigh of relief in the room. And so I think if you don't necessarily want to you don't necessarily want to mess with the kind of internal dynamics by having someone from internally kind of come out and be really vulnerable, find someone from outside your organization who will come in and do that for you, because I've received so much feedback on increased uptake on support that's already there after I've come in and said it's all right to have made all of these mistakes, and you're allowed to get help for these things. You don't have to just continue to punish yourself. But the thing that I talk about at any time I'm asked this question is, and it's a really, really practical thing, and I don't necessarily think that it costs a fortune to implement, is please stop expecting your team members to pay out of pocket for company expenses and wait to be reimbursed. That almost broke me and my husband several times when we were struggling financially. If it was 150 quid's train fare here and there, quite often the approval process for being paid back could take until the end of the following month. There are so many different softwares and platforms that you can use that don't involve just giving someone carte blanche on a company credit card, where people don't have to pay out of pocket. especially at the moment, you cannot assume that your team members can afford to be out of pocket by all of that money for all of that time. So that's my like number one thing. If you can do one thing when you get off this call today to make sure that your team members aren't really drowning, I would say it's that.
Thanks, Claire. We've got loads of questions that have come through, and just under 10 minutes, so I wanted to make sure we can answer some of those. There's quite a few people who have written in, I guess, on the topic of there being stigma surrounding this conversation. And Claire, perhaps coming to you first, I'd love to get your view and to share your thoughts with the audience. Someone has raised that talking about their finances can feel difficult, and how would you go about raising that with your manager and perhaps even asking for a salary review?
Yeah, so I think there are two different things here. So talking about finances openly, like in your workplace and with colleagues, is one thing, whether that's like with a colleague who's a friend and you're kind of sharing worries, or if it is talking to colleagues to make sure that fair pay is present in your institution, and just to sort of say I once had a contract that forbade me from talking about remuneration. I didn't realize that that's not actually enforceable. So your company can make it so that you can't talk about salary and bonuses while you're on the premises. They cannot forbid you from discussing it at all. So sharing that information with colleagues to make sure that there's fair pay present is allowed, and especially if you're friendly with people, it's actually really important. But that's more to do with personal finance. And the other side of things is when you're going in for a salary review, I always advise people not to make it about your need for the money. You make it about your value to the company. So now's a really good time to start doing this. If you're if you're hoping for a salary review in the new year, which is obviously when lots of companies do them. So like going through some of your really successful projects, looking at market rates for your role, compiling basically like a stack of evidence of your value to the company. That's always the right way to go about it, not necessarily making it about the cost of living crisis. This is that need for the cash, I really believe, is something that is like a valid, it's a valid sort of discussion, and it's what we're seeing kind of discussed with unions and in public sector pay, but it's a very different conversation to have that on your own. I would always advise, if you're going in for a salary review, do your research, think about your value to the company, decide the salary that you think you want, and maybe a salary that you would be prepared to accept, and make it about that rather than about needing the money, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice. Thank you, Claire. Slightly linked to that, we've had another question around the differences in how we view money based on our gender. And Julia, I'd love to get your thoughts, given your time working in people functions in different businesses. Is this something that you have witnessed? And they reference, the person posing the question references that even though the way that, traditionally men were encouraged to be looking after the money, going out and earning money, and women less so, we are moving towards more parity. She said that, she feels it's still not encouraged for women to be seeking economic abundance or fighting for more. And I wondered if that is something you had seen in your career, and perhaps how you'd advise people on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably opening a can of worms, isn't it? Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's still, it absolutely is prevalent, without a doubt. So gender pay gap, all of that is there, and we know that, and obviously organisations now having to report on their gender pay gap helps. But absolutely, I think from personal experience and working with lots of women, particularly in roles where we just don't feel comfortable asking for, I guess, like not so much asking for money, but as you say, defining our value. We don't value ourselves enough, probably what I'd say. Generally, women don't value themselves enough. And although we've come really far, and we're, yes, it is 3 women sitting on this webinar, and that's fantastic, but we don't value it. And I can think of multiple examples where colleagues or friends have gone for a new role, and they we're the typical, aren't we, where we look at a job description, right, well, I can't do one of those things, therefore I'm not going to apply for it. And whereas men look and see, and they can do like one of the things, and they think, I'm going to apply for it. So and that happens still all the time. Like the difference in terms of how we value ourselves and what's expected and what's acceptable is still very much kind of in our kind of unconscious or conscious bias, really. So I think it's really important. I think, to Claire's point, I think it's really important that we do value ourselves. I think arming yourself with that evidence is really important. Practicing those conversations with colleagues and friends can be really helpful. Keeping your CV up to date with every single thing that you've done, so that you're ready, if you need to go into those conversations, and that there are opportunities that open up, with the Great Resignation. There's a lot of churn at the moment in organizations, so keeping yourself kind of ready to move to a next role, if that's what's available for you, I think is really important. But yeah, not being afraid to value yourself and to do the research in terms of benchmarking and seeing what your market value is, I think also is something that women don't tend to sort of, there's an acceptance of, this is just what I do and I'm just going to stay here. But putting your head above the parapet and having a look and seeing what others are doing, I think is also really important. So, and not being afraid to ask.
Thanks, Julia. Claire, have you seen that difference in the client base that you support?
Definitely. I mean, I work with 90% women, I would say, and so I think there's a real difficulty in that women are in a bit of a triple bind financially. So we're still paid less. Julia mentioned the gender pay gap that hasn't gone away, and it's closing too slowly. And then we're marketed to relentlessly from when we're really young about things to sort of fix ourselves. And then the real kicker is that then women are quite often held up as these frivolous spenders, or paradigms of sort of frivolity. And so building financial confidence in women is actually faced by loads of kind of other external pressures. There's lots of studies on kind of the tone of articles that are aimed at women around money, always aimed around spending and spending less, whereas articles geared towards men are about investing and growing their wealth. And so I think one of the things that you can do as a woman to improve that financial confidence is actually look at what messages you're absorbing. So, there are some brilliant spaces, online spaces, where women can go and engage about money in a really positive way. There is the Black Girl Finance community, which is kind of specifically aimed at women of colour. There is Rain Check, which is kind of again a financial well-being and freedom community that's aimed at having those conversations and improving financial confidence in women. There's Vestpod, which is brilliant as well, and they do kind of face-to-face meetups as well. So I think really looking at the messages that you're absorbing and making sure that you are absorbing positive messages about money and your ability to manage it and your ability to grow some wealth and be financially independent is really important.
Thank you, Claire. We are out of time, so thank you for everybody who did share questions and sharing their thoughts on the chat. I've just put on the screen the QR code to our latest handbook called The Psychological Cost of Living. So useful for anybody who is navigating this within their workplaces. So I want to say a huge thank you to Julia and Claire for joining us today, giving your own perspectives, but also supporting those who are going through this themselves, who are supporting team members, or you might have a role like Julia's where this falls into your remit of looking after the organisation. Look out for the next webinars from us, and we will send through the recording to anyone who would like to share this around. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Claire. It's been great speaking with you.